All right, and we are live. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews, number 25, back after a nice long hiatus. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Corey. I'm very happy to be back. It's been a while. I know that we recorded a sort of a little like interim episode between this gap of time, but I'll just give if your listeners haven't heard that, but they hear this, I'll just give them kind of a quick kind of overview of why I took a little bit of a break.
That has not come out for the main feed yet. It was on Twitch, but so I don't know how many people actually saw it.
Yeah, so I'm happy to add that. So first off, I want to say thank you very much to everybody who's watched the show, who's enjoyed what we've had to do here over the last 24 episodes, now going to be 25. And a big part of hearing your great feedback was a big reason why I was like, okay, let's bring it back. But long story short, it was a variety of things, health challenges, personal life challenges. I was a part-time caretaker for my grandmother for most of last year.
Right.
And I can't remember exactly when we talked. I don't remember when. Was it like in October, November? I can't remember when we spoke.
November. It was November.
Yeah. So we probably spoke right before she died. So she died on November 28th.
Oh, yeah. No, I think she was still alive at the time. I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And so we had the service and everything for her. She was a wonderful woman. She's a big part of who I am today. And from the age of 14 on, she pretty much raised me. So, she was really important to me. And so I was just trying to deal with this chronic pain stuff I was dealing with and this and that and the other, and just was kind of tired. So, and so I sort of decided, okay, well, I need to take a little bit better care of myself. And so it was about sort of cutting things down and trying to sort of repair myself. And so one of the things was just sort of taking a break from this. I also sort of, when the episode comes out, you'll hear the whole story of it, but basically that I quit PSL. So I just really do want to thank folks for their interest in the show, and I'm glad to be bringing it back, and we're going to be bringing it back in a big way. We're going to try to record shows every 2 weeks. And we're going to be covering sort of, because I've decided to sort of, leave PSL and not necessarily be like a strict, Leninist anymore. I've decided that, Red Reviews should really be much more about the broad spectrum of political thought from the left. And so we're going to be covering, Marxist stuff. We're going to be covering Leninist stuff. We're going to be covering, sort of democratic socialism, libertarian socialism, anarchism. We're going to do a variety of episodes dealing with that. Really excited about the first few early ones that we're going to be doing, which include, we're going to be doing tonight, when Corey gets back, but tonight we're going to be doing David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything. I thought this was a good book to kind of bring the show back to, and I can't wait to get back to that. But we're going to do a bunch of other stuff too, and I was vamping for you for a bit, so I figured this.
Sorry,
no, you're fine. I figured this part might get cut out of the podcast feed, but for those watching live, if there are people watching live, then that way. Sort of vamping. But for the, but just to kind of reiterate what I said before you came back, long story short, I quit PSL, and I've decided that, I think I just sort of want to be for a while, I still am very much a socialist, very much dedicated to the socialist project. But I was really interested in studying and learning more about the wide variety of political thought on the left. And so this show is going to become more oriented towards sort of exploring all of the different types of leftist thought that's out there. So we'll cover Marxism, we'll cover, anarchist thought, libertarian socialist thought, democratic socialist thought. We're going to do a whole wide variety of stuff. And I'm really excited about the next few episodes sort of coming down the line, which I think are going to be great.
Yeah. Yeah, it looks like I was looking at the list that we've got here coming up, and it looks like it's going to be a pretty fun time the next little while.
Yeah, I think so. And I do want to let listeners know that, like, if you left a comment on any of the episodes about like, hey, you guys should cover this, I've tried my darndest to like accommodate that. So there's a lot of books that were discussed in that thread that are going to be included in this year's schedule. So, I want this show to be a lot more interactive, not just with Corey, but with the audience. And I want it to be a place where anybody's sort of political orientation on the left can kind of come and learn something from. That's kind of my broader goal for the show.
That sounds great to me.
So fantastic. So that's what I'm excited about.
In a sense, that's kind of what I've been doing with the interviews as well. Although I cannot deny that sometimes my personal biases get in the way, and I might talk some shit about some people that don't necessarily deserve it.
It's very easy. Like, I think here's the thing, and I've tried to try to figure out how I want to articulate this, but I think there's a difference between, like, I think genuine criticism and talking shit. So, like, criticism is like when you are sort of critical of like a particular point of like theory or methodology or whatever. Talking shit for me usually generally comes down to, well, that guy's a dick, or like, I'm not going to listen to him because he's an asshole. Like, it's usually kind of that kind of thing. So I think I think disagreements are healthy. That's part of the reason why one of the things I really enjoyed last year was the stream that we did with all of those different people. I thought that was a tremendous amount of fun. And I've been in contact with Ben Burgess to do a show with him, but that's been going back and forth now for, I don't know, months. He's a very busy guy, so hopefully he'll get back to me. But we intend to do some stuff on Scientology, which we will also be talking about later in the schedule. Probably not next episode, but the episode after that, we'll be covering Mike Rinder's book. So I'm excited about using this podcast as a way of not just talking about leftist theory, but also getting into other topics that I think are relevant, related to like religion or atheism or whatever, and humanism too.
Very cool. Yeah. No, right on. The streams was a thing. I wanted to do multiple of them. I had ideas for other opportunities, but I just could never schedule anything. Like, it just,
well, I mean, I'll tell you what. I mean, it's one of those things where I'm open to doing other streams outside of our regular episodes. So if there's a stream that we want to do, and if even it's just you and me, I'm happy to do that if people are interested. Especially like, especially if we can do like questions or sort of a office hours kind of thing, where if people have questions, we can try our best to answer them.
That sounds great. Yeah, we should definitely. So for viewers and listeners, definitely give us some questions.
Yeah, give us some questions. You leave them in the chat. You can email them to Corey. You can email them to me. There's a contact page on my website, justinclark.org. You can contact me too. And maybe we can put a bunch of those together and then, use those questions as a jumping off point to having some streams and stuff. I would love to do that. I think that would be a tremendous amount of fun.
Absolutely. So I guess without further ado, we are covering a book
We
tonight.
Sure are. I feel like we're sort of reintroducing Read Reviews with a bang, because I think this book is really, really, really good. And I'm very excited to be talking about it tonight. But the book we're doing is The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. This book is an absolute doorstop. It basically took me like off and on like 6 months to read it, because I was reading other things and doing other things while I was reading it. But I was absolutely blown away by this book. I think it changed a lot of my assumptions about how I thought sort of humanity evolved, how we developed systems, and what that sort of means going forward. So some background on the author. So David Graeber is, I think for our audience, maybe doesn't need much of an introduction, but
probably not.
David Graeber was an anthropologist, and he was an anarchist, and he was one of the main founders of the Occupy movement back in 2010, 2011. And he's written a tremendous amount of really super interesting books. One of them is Bullshit Jobs, which a lot of people know. That's a great book. Maybe we'll cover on the podcast in the future. And
or Debt, the First 5,000 Years.
Debt's the other one. And then he has another book that's a collection of essays that I really liked called The Utopia of Rules.
Okay, interesting.
Where he posits that Star Trek is essentially space Leninism. And that's been boiling in my mind for like 6 months when I read that book. Okay. I'm like, that's very interesting. And he just sort of drops it as sort of a passive. He was writing about something else, but he sort of mentions it in passing. And I'm like, that's really interesting. You should mention more about that.
Like a throwaway line.
Yeah.
Hey, wait
that's
a minute.
kind of interesting, But anyway, so, And then David Wengrow was his collaborator. He is an archaeologist. So you have David Graeber, who was an anthropologist. He died in 2020, sadly. Yep. And then David Wengrow is an archaeologist. And so this was a project that they intended to be like multiple books. Like they had this idea of doing a multiple book series on these sort of big core assumptions that we take in political philosophy or in just the history of humanity in general. And so this book was the product of like 10 years. They worked on it off and on for 10 years. And I think in the introduction, Wengrow talks about how their writing became so intertwined that it's very hard to tell who wrote what. And I think that's actually kind of true. Although I will say that there are times where I think it's cleverness and its sort of pithy way of putting things. I'm like, okay, Graeber probably wrote that part.
That's got to be
a Graeber part. So the book sort of started for them so the book came out in 2021. So they've been working on it for 10 years. So they started working on this when Graeber was working on Occupy, right? And for those who may be a little younger who don't remember Occupy Wall Street was this huge social movement that came sort of out of the ashes of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And that's where we get the We Are the 99%. Like that's Occupy. Yeah. And the idea was to basically occupy spaces of capitalism, whether it be Wall Street or other places, to sort of make a point of saying that income inequality is unacceptable, that we live in a society where so few have so much, while so many have so little. And so the book sort of starts with him sort of trying to ask that question of why is inequality so bad? And there have been many, many books that have sort of tried to tackle the why inequality is bad, like or why inequality is a problem. Like I think of, like obviously Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, or Joseph Stiglitz's book, The Price of Inequality. Like it's been a really hot topic. Robert Reich's Inequality for All. Like this is a topic that people are really concerned about because especially in the United States, Western Europe, but pretty much globally, there is this sort of, very small amount of people who have almost everything. They own almost all the wealth. Yeah. And if you look at, especially since the sort of advent of neoliberalism in the 1970s, we've seen where, people who have, again, America, for example, we've talked about this before, you see the graphs where productivity goes through the roof, but wages either stagnate or actually go down, accounting for inflation. Yeah. And so they've sort of opened the question with, why is inequality a problem? And then they sort of started to do the research and they realized, actually, there's a more foundational question here that we actually have to get to the heart of. And it is, why do we care about inequality? And not in sort of a right-wing way, obviously, not in a, we shouldn't care about inequality,
but literally what causes us to
care about it? And that gets into their, interestingly, analysis. So starting with what they call the indigenous critique. So what they're pulling from in terms of the way that we think about inequality, a lot of it comes from the sort of, not romantic, but the sort of Enlightenment tradition. We think of people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Thomas Hobbes. Right. And Hobbes and Rousseau have been sort of battling it out in political philosophy from the very beginning, right? So, Rousseau is sort of like men are born free and are forever put in chains, right? So it's like, humans were born equal. We were all equal. We lived freely and equal. And it wasn't until sort of the advent of agriculture and the state that we became sort of burdened by, the surplus of those kinds of ways of developing food and so forth. And that led to inequality. And then you have Hobbes, which is the whole thing of it's like, inequality is just sort of baked in. It's part of the system itself.
Hobbes was the war of all against all. And life is brutish.
Yeah, nasty, brutish, and short. Yeah. And so in the book, they talk about that sort of divide. And they talk about how, what Graeber and Wengrow sort of think about is like, okay, well, why did Rousseau care about inequality so much? Why was that such a thing? And it turns out that a lot of the Enlightenment writers, including Rousseau, learned about sort of the nature of inequality or thinking of inequality as a concept from Native Americans, from indigenous Americans whose testimonies were sort of taken by Jesuit priests, French Jesuit priests in like the 16th and 17th century into the 18th centuries. They're writing down how, the Native Americans are sort of dumbfounded by the way that Europeans treat each other. And obviously treat them too. And it really gets to the heart of like, then it sort of comes, okay, well, why do we care about inequality? And then it comes to an even bigger question, which is like, we have this assumption that through most of human history, if you think of sort of big history stories, whether it's talking about the sort of what we call like sort of the Whig theory of history, where we're sort of going into successive stages and each successive stage is like sort of more progressive than the previous one. And we're all going towards this sort of apex of industrialization, capitalism, so forth. And what Graeber and Wengrow are really, really interested in is realizing, going back and saying, well, what does the actual archaeological and anthropological evidence say about this supposed fall from grace of Rousseau, or the sort of brutish nature of reality from Hobbes? And because both Hobbes and Rousseau, those were thought experiments. They weren't meant to be taken literally. They were meant to be taken sort of figuratively. But like all great texts, they often then become sort of interpreted literally. And so then they start asking the bigger questions of, did societies really go from hunter-gatherer, agriculture, industry, like, did they actually go that cleanly? And it turns out that they didn't. And not only didn't they, but some of them actively chose which stage they wanted to be in, which puts us completely at odds. We sort of assume that politics starts with agriculture, and that's just not true. And so, and we can get more into that as we go forward, but that's kind of the setup of the book. Is it's really sort of a complete reimagining of the human story, and recognizing that humans actually have had a hell of a lot more intelligence and agency and, quite frankly, political theory from the very beginning, instead of saying that it just sort of was a process of development that would lead us to eventually the sort of political developments that we've seen in the world today.
Yeah, I think I don't know, chapter 7, I think, is where I'm at listening to it. So yeah, it's interesting to me, some of the ways that it would present. Or I might be confusing it with debt also, because I'm kind of listening to
That's all right.
as well.
That's fine.
But it's like, it would present like, this is what we assumed about this kind of culture and where they should be. And this is where they actually were based on what we know. And here's the things we don't actually know. So there's still a lot of missing parts to what we can, conclusions we can make about past civilization.
Yeah, sure. And so they sort of start to talk about sort of specific examples, because the book has really great setups, and it does what I love of all great books that are fun to read, which is that they sort of debunk ideas of others that are largely sort of taken for granted, that are probably not true, or at the very least, they're too simplistic. So like, they're very critical of like Jared Diamond, for example, who, like Graeber, was somebody who sort of studied indigenous peoples, and sort of, he's the guy who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, has a much more determinist view of like humanity, where we're very much constrained by geography, we're constrained by technology, and we're constrained by disease, hence the Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he talks about how there are certain events that sort of happen that we didn't have any control over, that lead us to having the kind of changes within human societies that would come. But they try to turn that on its head and say, well, actually, the archaeological evidence suggests a very different story. And so they talk about how there are some societies who developed agriculture largely kind of for fun. Like, they were trying to figure it out just to see if it would work. And then for some it would not. And so they would just go back to being hunter-gatherers. And then some societies, especially like, during like pre-Ice Age and Ice Age, some of them would be like hunter-gatherer like half of the year. And then the other half, they would be sort of horticulturalists. And so they would sort of bounce back and forth. And what this suggests is that earlier societies thought very deeply about what kind of development of life they wanted to lead. And as a result, they decided that, and made very political decisions of saying, well, we're going to actively develop agriculture here, and we're actively going to do something else over there. And so like when it comes to like agriculture, during periods of those sort of agricultural stuff, the societies would tend to be a bit more horizontal. There would tend to be a bit more freedom, a little bit more autonomy. And then during the hunter-gatherer phases, there tend to be more hierarchical in terms of the tribe, in order to make sure everybody was kind of on the same page, and they would go back and forth. And so what we see in early peoples is deeply political decisions, which for most of, human history, we didn't, or most of like the studying of human history, we didn't really think was actually going on. But in many ways really was. Like they talk, for example, about how one of the ways in which inequality really developed was in sort of these early sort of ice age periods where you'd have these burials of these particularly important people. And sometimes they were sort of important in the tribe for their stature. Like sometimes literally if they were tall, than other people, they were sort of seen with reverence. Or if they were particularly short, they were sort of seen with reverence. Or if they had a particular different thing. And there would be these sort of early ceremonial systems sort of developed so that they would sort of bury them with all kinds of stuff. And we see this centuries and centuries before, history said this stuff should be happening. And said, well, you wouldn't get to this level of like inequality until you got to the agricultural period. It turns out actually, no, that was there from the start.
Right.
So that stuff I think is like super, super interesting.
Yeah, for sure. There was, I'm trying to think. The one thing I seem to recall they were, I guess maybe they were debunking, was the idea of that man was more like being trained by grain crops.
Yes.
Which I thought was interesting. But actually like, yes, the fact that we were growing crops and we had to learn how to grow crops, the fact that some cultures chose to reject that at various times demonstrates that it wasn't the crop that was training us. It was that we were doing this thing because we wanted to in some cases. Right?
Yeah. And it goes even beyond agriculture. So there's a chapter where they discuss Native American tribes on the west coast of North America. So in California up through, I think would be British Columbia. And they talk about how the sort of southern tribes were vehemently anti-slavery. So they didn't have slaves. They had specific prohibitions against it. But as you got north, they were very pro-slavery, where they had in that northern region in those tribes, they did have forms of slavery. And somewhere sort of in between that north and south were tribes that kind of went back and forth from doing one or the other. And they talk about that. There's a term for that where they call it schismogenesis, where it's sort of through a process of transition, one thing goes into another and it's not so clean. And I think that that's like super interesting too, because we don't often, when we think about slavery generally, like we have a very kind of specific image in our heads, like especially for me as an American, like we have a very specific image of what slavery is. And it turns out like Native American tribes also had forms of slavery. But again, that doesn't it's not like to say that it's exactly like, antebellum slavery. It wasn't in the United States. But the fact that, again, you see where tribes are actively making decisions based on specific needs and how those play sort of back and forth, I think just really, again, underscores how, I think one of the central core ideas of David Graeber's, I think, entire canon is the idea that all of these systems are made up. We make them all up. And we can just as easily unmake them and do something else. Yeah. We're so wedded to these ideas because we sort of think of them as being sort of natural. And it's like, no, like we can just as easily decide one day, hey, we're not doing this anymore. And very much like that, we're not going to grow crops right now because it's not advantageous to us, or we're not going to be hunter-gatherers right now because it's more advantageous for us to do this. To be agricultural. So I think it really gets into talking about how, because there's so much in the book, and I know we're not going to cover it like in an hour or an hour and a half, but I want to try to hit like the highlights in terms of what I think is interesting. So like they talk about how the political process, we often think of, there's a great chapter in the book called Why the State Has No Origin. And they talk about how states are things that sort of developed over time. There wasn't any specific, the traditional notion of the origin of the state can come from a variety of different things. Generally, it's some, sort of reiteration of the Rousseau thing, especially in Marxism. Friedrich Engels wrote a whole book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. So he kind of lays it out.
Right.
And in that book, Engels sort of makes the point of saying that it's a succession of different modes of development. And so once you get to the development of agriculture, societies move away from being sort of matriarchal in terms of women sort of having more substantial political roles in society to a patriarchal system. And then he sort of talks about how the state developed as a response to the needs of the development of surpluses in agriculture, right? And what Graeber and Wengrow kind of lay out is that some of that's probably true, but it's actually more complicated than that. And so, like anything is.
Go figure, yeah.
And so what they talk about is that states are usually guided by sort of three things. It's the monopoly on violence, which is, I think, the one that pretty much everybody knows. Because that, and that kind of is usually tied to Max Weber, the sociologist. So the monopoly on the use of force is a big part of what a state is. The other thing is a monopoly on the use and dissemination of, on the creation and dissemination of information. So the control of information is really important in government, right? This is where you get this sense of bureaucracy.
That makes sense.
And the sense of development of how we both gather knowledge and then share knowledge, or not just create knowledge or share knowledge, but how to withhold knowledge, how to control knowledge, because that's a really important component of a state too, right? Think about how, in most Western countries, there's an intelligence agency, right? And a lot of the information that they have, they don't share fully with the public under national security, right? So those are the two that are really important. And then there's the third one, which is charismatic politics. And this is the one that I think is like the most sort of ethereal. It's the one that's a little more squishy than the other two, but it's the one that I think is also super important. And what that is that whether we're talking about the earliest hunter-gatherer tribes all the way up to highly developed industrial states like we live under today, there is a certain level of charismatic adherence to leaders that makes a state function, right? So we think about, the example within recent modern politics is Trump. Trump is
the hero worship.
It's the hero worship. There are many words you can describe Trump, that are bad, and I would agree with all of them. But I think charismatic is kind of important. And I'm not saying that they're exactly the same, but like Barack Obama had that same level of sort of charisma, and there was a sort of group of people that developed around him. Or if you think of like the Soviet Union, right? Like the sort of what they call the cult of Lenin, like that Lenin statues everywhere, and that his body was preserved when he died, and it was on display. It's still on display.
People would,
nearly 100 years after his death, that you can go and see it, or like Mount Rushmore, or the Lincoln Memorial, or or I'm trying to think of a Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. I don't know if there's statues to Pierre Trudeau.
Sir John MacDonald,
right? Like there's a John MacDonald statue somewhere, right? And so
absolutely,
the charismatic, it's sort of a binding agent that makes a state function, because we sort of put but we put a huge amount of our sort of hopes and dreams into those people, much like you would like a religious figure, because I think it's kind of the same thing. I don't like when I think of the Pope, I think of the Pope as being a very political figure as much as he is a religious figure, because the Vatican is essentially a state. So So those three are really important. Now, one thing that they get into in the latter part of the book when they're talking about different societies, whether it's like the Incas or the Mayas or the Aztecs or other, in more sort of pre-modern societies, ironically enough, some of them in Ukraine, Turkey, where you think of like what is modern day Turkey, like Göbekli Tepe, which is one of the earliest, societies that had some forms of ritual and art that sort of binded societies together. What we find is that those three things are not necessarily everything you need for a state. So like some states are organized around like monopoly of violence, right? So you have like highly militaristic societies. You think of like something like Sparta, for example.
Right.
And then you have societies that might be both militaristic and then highly bureaucratized. So we think of like in sort of ancient societies, we might think of Rome as a good example of that.
Okay. Yeah.
And then one that has sort of all three is generally most of the time is a modern state. So when we think of like, say, for example, the United States or Canada, or even like the People's Republic of China, right? Because like, Mao is this sort of charismatic figure, right? It sort of binds the country together, not just as a physical manifestation, but also as kind of a myth, right? There's as much of a myth of Mao as there is the man of Mao, right? Much as like in the United States, there's like the myth of Abraham Lincoln, and then there's the actual man,
the founding fathers,
right? And now, like with China, especially, like I think China has all three in the sense that they are deeply controlled with a monopoly on the use of violence. They absolutely are a society that controls information. Anybody who's tried to puncture their great firewall knows that, or or people who. People who want to gain information that might be critical of the government, so on and so forth, and then that charismatic politics with like somebody like Xi, right? And the United States has a good parallel, right? We have the largest military in the world. We have 800 military bases all around the world, so we certainly have the violence part. The information part, I think, is important. If you think of something like the CIA or the NSA that gain information that maybe they don't always share, And then we have charismatic politics, right? Where, people who are elected into positions of power have to be esteemed by their peers. And that has to be shown either in the form of deference or in the form of voting. A good example of this right now is what happened today, the day that we're recording this. The U.S. House of Representatives is having its vote on who will be the next Speaker of the House. And
they can't agree.
Right? So, and in fact, on the first ballot, Hakeem Jeffries, who was the Democratic leader in the House, got more votes for Speaker than Kevin McCarthy, who was supposed to be the Speaker of the House of the Republicans.
Favorite,
right? And so those three things are so important. And they talk about how different societies developed different ways of doing it. So sometimes they might just have the charismatic politics, which was often centered around games and sort of games of sport or games of competition. And then you have some that are like maybe the monopoly on violence, or maybe they're monopoly of violence and charismatic politics, or maybe they're information and charismatic politics. And sort of at the end of the day, what they're trying to get at is that the state doesn't have like a clean origin in the way that people often think it does. It's very much like the process of evolution, right? There is no first man. There is no first human, right? At some point, there's a differentiation enough between, Homo habilis or, Homo erectus and Homo sapiens.
It makes me think of the grain of sand thing. How many grains of sand become a pile? Well, how much does a city state or a city have to? How many characteristics of a state does it have to have before it finally becomes a state? Right?
No, that's exactly right. And they talk about, because this was the chapter I thought was super, super sort of interesting. And in terms of thinking about how, like I said, some societies were sort of matriarchal and they were led by women. Some were led by men. Some were sort of led by a mixture of both. And those were all very active decisions. The way we often think about ancient history is we sort of think about it, or prehistory or prehistorical times, we often think about it as being highly deterministic, which is kind of the way that sort of Jared Diamond thinks of the world, right? Where everything is, we're all kind of sort of victims of circumstance. And some of that's kind of true, but some of it isn't, and that goes back to, Marx's great quote in the 18th Brumaire, where he's sort of paraphrasing Hegel, which is that men make history, but not in their conditions of their choosing. Right. And I would amend that based on what we've learned from Wengrow and Graeber's research, which is men sometimes make history and sometimes it's in the conditions of their choosing. Like, I think sometimes it isn't, sometimes it is. Sometimes they don't have a choice. Sometimes they do. And I think again, it really gets down to the fact that one of the core aspects of a society that we want to build, not a state, right, but a society, because we as leftists, our long-term goal is a stateless society. When we no longer have to have a government to do all of these things, that we collectively do them as a part of the abundance of living in a society where we no longer have to think about scarcity. Capitalism creates a tremendous amount of artificial scarcity. It's part of the reason why we have so much conflict. And, and we can discuss the different ways we get there, right? But one of I think the core hallmarks of what political involvement should mean is a commitment to freedom. And one of the things that they talk about in the book when they're talking about freedom is, because we sort of often talk about freedom in sort of the abstract, like freedom of speech or freedom of worship, but they're actually saying, no, there are actually some things that are even more foundational to be free. One of them is the freedom to move, the freedom to go where you want. And in modern society, you kind of don't have that freedom.
No, not really. We think of it in the US or in Canada, we think of it as we're free to travel within our country, and that's great, but it's still restricted freedom, right? It's still not universal.
And why is that restricted? Because if you go to the border without a passport and you try to walk in, they might hassle you for it. And ultimately it comes down to that they enforce it by the end of a gun. And, now, do I think they're going to hassle me too much based on my complexion? Probably not. But I have a feeling that if I was Latino or Hispanic, I imagine I'd probably get some shit trying to go through the border, right? And we see this right now at the southern border of the United States. We've seen this for years where, if we lived in a truly free world where people were free to do what they wanted, they would be free to leave and go to other places. And for economic opportunity. And in fact, the sort of architects of neoliberalism all promised that. They all said, with globalization, the world is now a village. We all belong to the global village, so you can go where you want. That was a lie. They weren't that what they were saying was that capital can go wherever it wants, but people cannot.
But no, you the worker.
You the worker,
you cannot.
You the free agent, you can't do that. And so when we talk about what would it mean to build a free society, it has to be beyond more than just securing sort of political rights, which I think are so important. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of due process, all of the Bill of Rights, all those are so important. But what's equally important is sort of freedom of movement and freedom to, in a greater or lesser sense, to disobey, to say no, and to resist when a society can become tyrannical and violate our sense of well-being.
Yep, absolutely. At some point, a state or a society, if it's imposing its will on you, and you can see this even in fictional anarchist societies, there still becomes a point where the people within that society are like, well, this seems like they're forcing the societal will onto me, and it doesn't feel right, right?
And I feel like that's what I think they're trying to hint at in this work, because the thing I like about what Graeber does is he's showing you, here's all the evidence, both of them, him and Wengrow. They're like, here's all the evidence, right? But then here's our perspective on this as sort of political radicals. We're making a stronger argument to say that there is no clear way to do any of this. And that we can, decide more for ourselves. And there's a really interesting aside, and I can't remember which chapter it's in, but they talk about how, back in more ancient times, political systems rose and fell all the time. They changed all the time. Yeah. You could live within a completely different political system within, a generation or two. And he talks about how the modern world is so stuck. We are so stuck. And we can't seem to get beyond where we are.
We think that it's like people think that it's great that their country is 150 years old or whatever. It's like, except we shouldn't be like that.
Right.
Like, things should be changed.
And what's interesting is that if you take it back to the founders, I mean, Jefferson and Madison were very explicit about how this Constitution, you should tear this thing up every couple of decades and write this completely new. But unfortunately, we now treat it as if it's like a sacred document. It's like the 10 Commandments.
Right, yeah, it's supposed to be a living document.
It is a living, breathing document. That is what, and in the United States, there's really sort of broadly two camps. There's the sort of broader camp of that it's a living document that changes with time and that we interpret it based on changing attitudes and social mores. And that's democratic. And then there's what they call originalists, or strict constructionists who say, well, this is what the words are.
Yeah, textualists, whatever you want to
call them. Antonin Scalia was one of those. Thomas is one of those in the court now. Most of the people on the U.S. Supreme Court are this.
It's interesting. I when I was first exploring anarchism, I read some stuff written by like Thomas Jefferson and some of the founding documents, and like, you go, well, this sounds like they intended this to be a pure democracy, like true anarchism, and except they were wealthy slave-owning white guys. But the way they worded it, I was like, that's very inspiring, right? Like it sounds great, but then it kind of became this rigid hierarchical, thing that can't be changed.
Right. And even if you go back to somebody like Thomas Paine, who what I would argue is both probably the most, I think, thoughtful and quite frankly, the most moral of the founding fathers. He never owned slaves, wasn't an attorney for slave owners like the Adamses were. Like, he never had a dog in that fight. But if you read like Common Sense, for example, he starts Common Sense with saying, if men were angels, we'd need no government. And he talks about how if we could learn to live together, we wouldn't need government. We need government because we don't know how to live with one another.
So we got to figure this out.
We have to sort of figure it out. And he talks about government being sort of a necessary evil. Now, there's sort of a crappy sort of right-wing way of reading that, which is what sort of Glenn Beck did. When I was in college, I read Common Sense when I was in college. And when I was in college at the time, Glenn Beck was very popular, and he had written his own version of Common Sense. And of course, it's like extremely right-wing. But actually, if you actually read what Paine's writing, it's quite frankly, he's advocating between this and other essays like Rights of Man or Agrarian Justice. He's sort of advocating for a small L libertarian socialism is what he's arguing for, where you have a highly decentralized society, but within that decentralized society, you have systems of social support that help people and build, it's very much akin to what we talked about with Kropotkin and the Conquest of Bread.
Oh, yeah.
That sort of anarchistic communism. And so what I think is so fascinating about the ideas of thinking about anarchism, because that's the thing for me going into 2023, that I'm going to be reading a lot more about anarchist theory and getting into it. Like there's a libertarian anarchist Marxist named Daniel Guerin, and we'll, I think, do one of his books later on about anarchism later this year. And sort of talking about ways in which I think Marxism and anarchism are not necessarily mutually exclusive, that there's a lot of overlap. And I think that's extremely, extremely important. But anyway, so back to the book. I mean, the thing that I really, really like is about this whole book, because the whole thing was, I think, this book is Nassam Nicholas Taleb's like little blurb on the dust jacket's perfect, because he says this is not a book, it's an intellectual feast, and he's absolutely right. So what they sort of develop and talk about in the last chapter, when they're talking, the chapter's called Full Circle, because it's the chapter starting to wrap everything up, and then they're also talking about indigenous societies in North America that developed forms of democratic institutions. So like, for example, like I don't know if we can see this, but like the Osage village, and you'd have them sitting around a table to sort of figure things out. One of the things that you'll often hear is that you had what was called the Iroquois League or the Iroquois Nations, and how their system of government was actually fairly influential in the founders of the United States. Some of that's true in the sense that those early systems were developed to settle disputes between different aspects of tribes, but they sort of combined to share resources and expertise, and then figured out democratic governance as a way to sort of settle disputes. So like that stuff I think is like super informative and interesting. And where I think they really kind of tie it up nicely is thinking about how, we often, like, there's this sort of caricature of native peoples in North America, especially in the way that they're written. They're either sort of angels or devils. And it's like, no, they were people who had the same kind of, wants and desires that everybody else had.
And some were good and some were not as good.
So they talk about how like Cahokia was one where they had social hierarchies, and their games of sport were sort of monopolized by an elite. Or if you think about, it's like that there's no clear line between like what is a tribe, what is it, what is a society, what is a state. Like those are all real squishy. And the reason that we develop those terms is to try to get some sense of what that means, which I think is very important and correct, because if you look at, say, for example, the United States, like a lot of people don't know that the United States had a governing document before the Constitution. It was called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation was the sort of government document, the binding document of the United States from 76 or 77 up until 1787, when we adopted the Constitution. And the way the Constitution was written in and of itself, they had gotten together, a Constitutional Convention had been called, and the whole goal was to amend the Articles of Confederation. And then they all got in a room and said, actually, this sucks. Let's just make something new.
Write a new thing.
And so then they had to sort of justify why they were making something new, hence the Federalist Papers. This gets into, when Graeber and Wengrow's model of talking about information and the control of information. So they're writing a narrative about why we need the Constitution. And part of it was you had these, really high level rebellions against, colonial taxes that local folks weren't particularly thrilled about. But the U.S. government had to pay for the war, because they were indebted to the French and others. And one of the things that they did was a grand bargain was struck between Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington, which was Jefferson wanted the capital in the South, which is why Washington, D.C. is where it is. It was carved out of Maryland and Virginia, right? But Hamilton said, okay, I will give you that in exchange if we can consolidate the Revolutionary War debts and have it be a federal debt that we can then manage. And that was the grand bargain that was struck. It was done over lunch. And and so this sort of, and we think about it, and we're thinking about like, there's a lot of stuff within societies that deem themselves democratic that on the surface doesn't actually sound terribly democratic. Like
some guys just deciding a thing at lunch.
Deciding where the nation's capital is going to be and whether a country can assume all of the war debts from its states.
Yeah, like that's like if you think about like the kind of individual power that people have to have, even just to suggest something like that. Like I get to decide where the capital is, and I get to decide what the way we're handling this debt is. Like it's pretty dramatic, actually.
Yeah. And it is extremely dramatic. Or the Constitutional Convention, or the way. If you think of the Civil War, for example, in the United States, this slavery in the United States did not end peacefully. It ended with a violent civil war that killed 620,000 people, and and it was essentially a revolution. That's part of the reason why, for many children growing up in America, there were two portraits on the wall. One was Washington, the other one was Lincoln. Washington represents the first American Revolution, and Lincoln represents the second, where the United States goes from the United States are being a sort of loose confederacy of states to the United States is. And it's the centralization of power and authority, arguably under a charismatic figure like Lincoln, right? So we're going back to that three model.
Yeah.
So what they're sort of getting to is that there's this sort of standard thinking about what the Enlightenment is, and that the Enlightenment thinkers in France, England, Scotland, they're all coming up with these really interesting ideas about equality and rights and common goals and the public good, all these things that had been seen as so foreign to most of Europe for most of its history. I mean, you think about, first, Europe was sort of under the yoke of Rome. And then when Rome collapses, it then becomes under the yoke of either sort of small princely, kingdoms and eventually larger developed kingdoms with absolute monarchs, right? You think of Louis XIV, right. I am the state, right? But the Enlightenment sort of turns all that in its head. And there's often this story that, well, this stuff just sort of emerged out of the West. Well, where were they getting these ideas? They were getting these ideas from indigenous Americans and their critiques of European societies, and saying about, the level of hierarchy in your society is degrading. The way in which your spirituality is developed is degrading. The way in which your society is so unequal is dehumanizing. And you get sort of figures, like one of the big figures in the book is a guy named Candiaronk. I can't remember hopefully I'm saying that right. But Candiaronk was a Native American leader who had spoken very openly with other people, Westerners who had come to North America, and sort of critiqued what he saw of the sort of the savagery of the white man. Essentially, you guys are constantly killing each other, stealing each other's shit. Like, you're terrible to one another.
You have people starving in your streets.
Yeah,
and
it's horrible, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that Candiaronk and others like him, the kind of critiques that they have about European societies then become the critiques that are developed in the Enlightenment. Yeah, we often think, like I thought of for a long time, as the Enlightenment sort of being kind of its unique thing that was in Europe. And it's like, they're learning these ideas from Native Americans in North America or in South America to a certain extent, who are challenging what they've learned about European societies, whether it's absolute monarchy, deep levels of inequality, violence, wars of religion, and so forth. I think that's super, super interesting.
For sure. I know, I think there's a couple points in the book where they talk about like the controversy surrounding the existence of Candiaronk.
Yeah.
Because there are some people who asserted that he was like a representation. He wasn't a real person. But I don't know one way or the other, but they acknowledge it at least in the book.
And Candiaronk may not have been a real person. He might have been a figure very similar to Socrates or Jesus, where we don't have any firsthand, we don't have any primary sources on Jesus, and nor do we have any on Socrates. All we have about Socrates is what Plato wrote, who was his student. All we have about Jesus is what people wrote about him at the very minimum 70 to 80 years after he died, and some cases centuries after he died. Jesus may have been a real person. He may have been a composite of a bunch of different people. Candiaronk may have been that. Because the way that these Native American figures were sort of originally sort of thought of in these critiques as, obviously they're quote unquote savages, like they don't fucking know how to live. What these Enlightenment writers are using these Native Americans as the sort of narrative device to say what they really think, which is how they're often interpreted. And Graeber and Wengrow go, well, what if we actually just interpreted them the way they were sort of intended, which is that this is what this is a person, and this is what they actually said, and this is what they actually thought, and that sort of gets us to sort of the end of the book, and we can talk a little bit about like the conclusion of the book, where they talk about where does the dawn of everything, that term, come from, and it's from a guy named Mircea Eliade, who was a historian of religion. He wrote a very famous book called The Sacred and Profane. His work has gotten more play lately because of Jordan Peterson, frankly. But yeah.
Well, that's never good.
And spoiler alert, Eliade was Eliade was kind of a Nazi. But Wengrow and Graeber sort of take a term he described. I'm quoting from the book. It says, in traditional societies, according to Eliade, everything important has already happened. All the great founding gestures go back to the mythic times, the ilio tempore, the dawn of everything, when animals could talk or turn into humans. Sky and earth were not separated, and it was possible to create genuinely new things, marriage or cooking or war. And so what they're sort of getting at is, social, and they also say here, like, social science has largely been a study of the ways in which human beings are not free, the way that our actions and understandings might be said to be determined by forces outside of our control. But what if we do it differently? What if we think of it differently? And so that's right. Instead of, quoting the book again, instead of some male genius realizing a solitary vision, innovation in Neolithic societies was based on a collective body of knowledge accumulated over centuries, largely by women, in an endless series of apparently humble, but in fact enormously significant discoveries. And so it dehumanizes the process. If we're constantly talking about technology, or we're constantly talking about different modes of production, it's taking the human element out of it. So it takes out what they sort of talk about as being like ritual play, that the idea of trying things and seeing what sticks, playing around, gardens, they call them gardens of Adonis, where you're sort of trying to figure them out and see if gardening works. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, okay, we'll go back to whatever we were doing before. Maybe this will work better in the future. And I think what their project is really about is trying to put human agency back into social sciences. Because for so long, it's all been about ways in which we constrain one another. What if we flipped it and said, what if we studied things about the ways in which we can make each other more free? That we can make each other more equal, that we can make each other more compassionate towards one another, that we can be better to one another, that we can build better systems. And I think that is so important. And part of that lays into the sort of what they talk about being sort of the power of myth, where, they talk about, this is a great quote here. It's like, myth in itself is not the problem here. It should be mistaken for bad or infantile science. Just as all societies have their science, all societies have their myths. Myth is the way in which human societies give structure and meaning to experiences. But the larger mythic structures of history we've been deploying for the last several centuries simply don't work anymore. They are impossible to reconcile with the evidence now before our eyes, and the structures and meanings they encourage are tawdry, shop-worn, and politically disastrous. And I think that's true. And what they're talking about is that sort of deterministic structure of history instead of a human-oriented, agency-oriented view of history. And they end the book with, we are in the, I think it's like in the last measure, in the presence of myths. We all believe myths. It's often like, we often sort of talk about the sort of skeptics or atheists or whatever. It's like, well, I don't believe in myths. Myths are bullshit, blah, blah, blah. And I just read an interesting book where we talk about, there's kind of two different types of truth. There's denotative truth, which is, science, critical thinking, what's based on the evidence. But then there's also denotative or connotative truth, which is like mythic truth, and, if you think of like the story of the story of Superman, right? That's always my example, because I think Superman is kind of the best way to explain this. Superman is a young boy who is ripped from his home, and he is transported to a faraway land where he is taken in by strangers who raise them as their own. He then recognizes at some point that he has special powers. And with those powers, as Stan Lee said, they come with a certain level of responsibility. And there are times where the heroes that we believe in are the ones who make the ultimate sacrifice, right? So for Christians, that's Christ, right? Sacrificing himself for the salvation of humanity, right? Or if you think of, you think of somebody like, the Buddhists who lit themselves on fire to protest the Vietnam War, right? Martyrs. Yep. We think of martyrs as a good example of this. these all become
anarchists
right?
who've been imprisoned or
Yes,
killed by the state.
absolutely, right? We think of people like Alexander Berkman or Emma Goldman, or we think of, we think of like, in the sort of the Marxist tradition, you think of, people like Lenin, who is this exiled figure who comes back to his home and ignites a revolution that upends monarchy and develops for the first time in human history a real democratic society for the working people, right? Like that's a myth. Some of that's true, some of it isn't, but that's the myth, right?
It's the story.
It's the story, right?
Yeah.
And, and that's where, like, I think the relevance of understanding the importance of myth, right? Joseph Campbell, right? The power of myth. Myths are important because whether we like it or not, we all kind of believe in them because they are sort of connotatively true. They represent an ideal or a set of ideals with which we aspire to. And those matter. And trying to strip that out of social science is kind of stripping it, for lack of a better word, stripping it of its soul. That you you really kind of remove any sense of humanity from it. And that's what I think makes this book so important and why people should read it. I mean, I think we've been talking about an hour and we've only really scratched the surface here. There's so much interesting stuff in the book where they just go through example after example after example of how things have changed. But yeah, I think it was the book that really sort of shook me and made me realize that, like, there's no one way to do any of this. I think you need to be really weary of people who say, well, there's only one way to do this, and we know the one way, and it's this way. And it's like, well, how can you have so much confidence in that?
We're not in a ideal world, right? Like, so clearly, whatever the one way isn't working at this time.
And in a sense, you've bought into the myth. You buy the myth, whether it's the myth of capitalism and sort of meritocracy, or you're buying into the sort of myth of the, the vanguard party that leads the worker revolution, right? Like, I'm not saying those are bad or good. I'm saying that, like, people buy into narratives. Narratives matter. Stories matter.
Yeah.
We are a species that is guided by stories. And so if we kind of acknowledge that and recognize the importance of story and myth in understanding human societies and how they develop, maybe we can then start to come up with more new and more interesting ways of how we can build a better society together. Because because ultimately I do agree with Graeber and Wengrow that our system is stuck. Like it's like dead, but it kind of keeps plugging along. I don't know how to describe it. It's like a zombie. Like, it's technically dead. It's like undead. Like, it's not alive, but it's not really dead. Yeah,
like with people call it late stage capitalism, but we've reached the point where it's if there was a revolution, it should have happened, right?
Right. Well, that's the thing, right?
We're past the breaking point.
We are sort of we've had multiple breaking points. Yeah. And then it just somehow it just doesn't happen. And people can say, well, people aren't class conscious enough. Well, that's essentially, that's basically kind of like if you're in an MLM and you can't sell your shitty like Herbalife crap, and the person higher up in your downline says, well, you're just not working hard enough. That's essentially that argument. It's like people can be all kinds of class conscious. Just because they know something doesn't necessarily mean they put it into action.
That's true.
And I think that the fact that a revolution hasn't happened yet is a key indication that, like, there's nothing determining it. Like, if there's no, you know what I mean? Like I think we talked before. I said, sometimes this stuff has the sort of when does Jesus come back problem. I mean, Christians have said that Jesus is coming back for 2,000 years. And last I checked, motherfucker's not here yet. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it's like,
that's right.
So when people say things like, oh, the contradictions of capitalism, they're just too intense. Any day now, it's going to fall apart. It's like, well, it's continued.
It's been
falling apart, and yet shit doesn't change.
Yeah.
So, and we're going to talk more about that when we cover Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher.
Right.
But
because that's a big
part of it is this, we're a part of this system. It's horrible. Everybody kind of agrees that it sucks, but we can't seem to get beyond it. And so I think that this book is a part of starting to ask that question of how could we do it differently? How could we be different? And
I like
and
that.
I think I like that, and I like that too. I like the sense of agency. I like the sense of saying, like, no, we are human beings. We have freedom. We have freedom to do this. Let's accept that freedom and move on. Because I think that's and do something, do the work, right? Because I'm at this point in my life, I've hit a place where I've sort of disillusion's a bad word. It's not really what I mean, but more sense I've become a lot more realistic in the sense that I think it does a great disservice when all we do all the time is just talk shit or just criticize for the sake of criticism of other people who don't exactly fit what we think. And it's like, do you guys not understand how much this is like Protestants arguing with Catholics in like the 11th century? Like, you not, or the 17th century rather. Protestants didn't exist in the 11th century, right? but you know, like it's similar to that, right? Like the wars of religion. Like it's you know, I have the correct interpretation of X, and it's like, how do you know that? You know, and so I think part of learning from Graeber has been this sense of humility, of kind of acknowledging that, like, it's a sense of humility, but also a sense of like deep agency. It's like, because you know there's no one way to do this, it should give you the sort of inspiration to say, well, there's all kinds of ways we could do this. And there's no one way of building a better society, but we all have to be committed to doing it. And so I think that's really important. And I think that it's a book that is something that everybody should read. I loved it. I thought it was kind of like, it really was kind of mind-changing for me. I mean, in terms of thinking about not just the Enlightenment, because I've studied the Enlightenment for years in terms of writing about it and thinking about it. And it completely changed how I view the Enlightenment, and realized that it was a much more, you know, dialectical process between these native peoples and what these Europeans are writing about.
It kills the great man kind of version of the Enlightenment.
It really does. Kind of kills that idea. And it doesn't discount like the contributions of those thinkers. What it does do is it gives it a sense of context where you're like, well, where are they getting some of this from? They're certainly not getting it from the church. So where are they getting it? You know,
it's just out of nowhere. Like they just had these ideas out of the blue.
No, they come out of these narratives of the indigenous critique. And when you think about that, you go like, whoa, like that's kind of neat. It's like the indigenous critique sort of influences the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment sort of leads to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Right. You know, but then but then obviously the United States is also a country that sort of learn from those peoples while simultaneously committing genocide against them. So it's,
of course, you can't ignore that part.
No, I don't think you can either. So The Dawn of Everything. People should check it out. I think it's great, and I think it's something to go back to. I think it's a book that you can kind of open up on any page and kind of learn something from, which I think is kind of exciting.
Nice. Yeah, I've seen recently a couple of. There's a podcast where they're dedicating multiple episodes to critiquing The Dawn of Everything. And one of the criticisms that I saw people making was that it wasn't materialist enough. Like they kind of focused, I don't know, I guess they ignored the material conditions that were causing inequality. But I didn't get that when I was reading it or listening to it, I guess. Like, I don't know. People, I guess, hear different things maybe.
Yeah. I don't get that either, considering the wealth of archaeological evidence that they're sort of sharing with you on almost every page. I mean, it's a book that's saying like, here is what the evidence tells us.
Right. And they're not saying like inequality came from this particular thing, regardless, like human agency, regardless of the material conditions. They're describing the ways in which human beings interacted with their environment and the conditions surrounding them, as well as incorporating some human agency as well.
Yes. And I think I think that's right, because the thing I found really refreshing about the book was there is a tremendous amount of a lot of like core values and ideals that sort of go through the book, but the book is like not, I don't know how to describe it. It's not ideological in that regard. It's not
that's
dramatic.
right. Yeah.
It's much more of a, here's it's a mix of here is what the evidence is showing us, and being deeply critical and skeptical and empirical and saying, here's what we know. Here's the myth. Here's what people have said. And here's the reality, right? Like, you know, and at the same time, they're also saying like that, you know, like the power of myth in and of itself. And those ideas are important. Like, I mean, I don't know. The older I get, the more and more I recognize that everybody's telling a story. And you can say, oh, well, it's not materialist enough. Okay, well, break that one down for me. What story are you telling? What would be sufficiently materialist for you?
Right.
You know what I mean?
What would that be? Yeah.
You know, and so sometimes I hear those kinds of things. And I haven't listened to the episode, so this is me criticizing something I haven't even fucking listened to. But you know, but generally when I hear those kinds of things of, well, it's not materialist enough, usually it's a criticism by Marxists of anarchists, generally.
Right.
And it's like,
usually.
And it's like, did they not read the German ideology? Like, do they not know what, like, Marx and Engels write? Like, Hegel sought to bring man to heaven, or
right.
You know, like earth to heaven, and we seek to bring heaven to earth. It's like, that's a myth. Like, that's a story.
Yeah.
That's like a guiding ideal that sort of guides the research. It's like, I don't know. It's everybody has those things. It's very, you know, unless you're like a nihilist or something, everybody, and even
some people
are, you know, everybody kind of has like myths that we all buy into. And that doesn't mean that they're like total bullshit. No, it just means that like we all buy into stories. There are narratives that we tell about ourselves and others that matter. So, I mean, if we're saying materialist is in empirical evidence, like I think the book is extremely materialist in the sense that it's laying out empirical evidence consistently and like showing you intense debates between different scholars and showing you how this was an interpretation and how new archaeological evidence sort of overturns that interpretation and so on and so forth. So, I don't really know where that's coming from, but you know, I'm happy to kind of hear what somebody else has to say.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm always open to other perspectives.
Yeah, me too. There's a sense,
but it's like you say, like I didn't get the impression. In fact, it was the thing that kind of annoyed me a little bit while listening to it, is that it lacked the ideology. Like I thought they were being very careful to stick to the evidence without making any real ideological claims, where I would be like, okay, now that's what I'm talking about. Like, this is anarchism, or this is socialism, right? Like,
I think
this is the one we want.
I think they do a very good job of that. And part of it is I think that what they're interested in more than anything is getting people to ask different questions more than necessarily giving everybody the right answers, which I think is so important. And, you know, I mean, it's much akin to, you know, what they might have come up with later, we'll never know because, you know, Graeber died. It's very much like, you know, Marx died before finishing volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, right? Like,
right. We don't know what those would have been.
Marx never wrote his grand treatise on the state. Like, he just never did it. He didn't live long enough to do it, right? So it's like, we can interpret sort of that through pieces here and there. And so I think throughout the book, there is stuff there that's like, oh, I get what they're trying to get at.
Right.
But more importantly, I think what they're more interested in doing is saying, like, there's these stories, myths, if you will, that we've sort of believed in for a very, very long time. And maybe they're not true. One, and two, even if they are true, they're only partially true, that they don't tell you the whole story. Right. So let's talk about the whole story. Let's do the whole story, or at the very least, get to the beginning of what the whole story is. And I think that matters. I mean, I think that's important. And I liked that. I mean, I found it, you know, it seemed more honest to me in a way, because it's like, not that necessarily like, you know, political tract writing is lying. I don't think that's true. But what I'm saying is that there was a certain level of honesty that I was pleasantly surprised by. Because books like Bullshit Jobs are a little bit more, you know, they are a little bit more ideological.
Yeah, that's right. Like he's telling a story in Bullshit Jobs about the way that things work. Right.
Yeah. And so I mean, I think that, you know, I think it's, you know, it's a book by two people who are, I think it's a healthy balance between like their more academic work and their more polemical work. And it's sort of a synthesis of the two. You know, and maybe it succeeds, maybe it doesn't. It succeeded for me. I loved it.
I think it's great.
But yeah, I do too. So yeah, people should definitely check it out. I think it's worth checking out. I think it's worth reading. I think David Wengrow recently did an interview with the folks at Novara Media in Britain about the book. So you can search that out. I know a lot of people, he's done interviews about the book, and talked about it and whatnot. So, you know, we'll see.
Yeah, he was on, when the Burke book first came out, he was on the Seriously Wrong podcast.
Oh, okay, cool.
To talk about it. Yeah. So, if people are interested, I can find links for that.
Yeah. It's always worthwhile for sure.
Well, I guess, what's left? What are we covering next time?
So next time we're going from big picture. We're talking about big history of humanity. We're going to be talking about the internet. and so we're going from the past deeply into the present. And we're going to be talking about Ben Tarnoff's new book, Internet for the People. It's a great book put out by Verso Books earlier last year. And he sort of talks about the ways in which neoliberalism has hijacked our freedom on the internet and how we can get it back.
Cool.
Yeah.
No, right on. And I guess the last thing, where can people find you?
So people can find me at justinclark.org. That's where everything is. I will be, I've got a new article coming out in the Truth Seeker in January, February. It's a review of Mike Rinder's book, A Billion Years, which we'll be covering on the podcast about him getting out of Scientology.
Nice.
And I look forward to not only that article coming out, but also I look forward to talking about that on the podcast, because that book is not like political per se, but I think there are some political lessons we can take from it. So yeah.
Very cool. Well, I guess that's it for tonight. Yeah. Thank you very much, Justin.
I think it was a great first episode back. I thought I'd be a little rusty, and I think I'm still kind of working out the kinks, but I think I did okay.
Yeah, I think it was great.
And I look forward to doing more and more of these as the weeks and months go. So I'm very excited to be back. And again, thanks to everybody who's been interested in the show and are interested in continuing to support the podcast and go support Corey on Patreon. I will do the pitch. I'll do the Patreon pitch for him.
Sure.
Go support. He does a tremendous amount of hard work, and he makes it very easy for me to come on here and do this. So support him on Patreon. So. Awesome. But again, thank you so much, man. It's been a pleasure, and it will continue to be a pleasure as we go forward.
For sure. All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other project. If you want to contribute to all of that, then you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on the podcast app of your choice would be great. If you want to find out more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes for links to all of my stuff, and check out my website, skepticalleftist.com. There you can check out my other show, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, the videos I do with my friend Damien Marie at Hope, and all my old content from the Brainstorm podcast. You can also find links to my Discord, Reddit, and Twitch. You can contact me through my website or by emailing mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. My Twitter is @skepticallefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Thanks so much for listening and or watching. And make sure to leave a comment on the video or on my website. Go join a local org or print off some posters and pamphlets and spread some propaganda.